Hey, it's Jed Xavier here, and welcome to the Jed Xavier Show podcast, where we help you become a high-performance human in life and business by helping you optimize your mind, energize your body, and potentialize your soul. So strap yourself in, hold on, and let's get going. In this podcast, I interview an internationally renowned leader in the field of positive psychology, Dr. Tim Sharp, also known as Dr. Happy. We talk about how to create high-performance happiness. We're going to dive into deep questions around what is happiness? Are people getting happier? What is the purpose of happiness? How do you become happier? What's the difference between pleasure and happiness? The chemicals' roles in happiness? Are men or women happier? Why study happiness at all? Is happiness inherited? Is there a particular age group that's happier? When did the quest for happiness become cool? And what's the biggest thing that surprised Dr. Happy in all his research over the years? We also look at many other interesting facts around creating high-performance happiness. And Dr. Sharp also shares candidly about his own challenging demons and journey at times with his ongoing battle to have a happier life himself. And this was truly a really courageous moment on this call. Dr. Sharp has 3 degrees in psychology, including a PhD. He is the founder and CHO, Chief Happiness Officer of the Happiness Institute, Australia's first organisation devoted solely to enhancing happiness in individuals, families and organisations. His primary area of interest is enhancing happiness at work, including building positive cultures, developing positive leadership and boosting resilience, optimism and positive working relationships. He's worked with numerous organisations including Twitter, Dyson, Ernst & Young, Allens, Arthur Robinson, IBM, AMP, Westpac, NAB, Coles, Coca-Cola, Telstra and a whole host of other massive companies globally. He also writes a regular column for the HIF's Healthy Lifestyle blog and has previously been a regular contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald. He's also appeared in 2 national TV shows. He's been on Sunrise, The Morning Show, Daily Edition, The Project, Studio 10, 60 Minutes, and many other shows. In addition, he's published 8 books, several of which have been translated into other languages and sold in countries all over the world. And he is the best-selling author of The Happiness Handbook, 100 Ways to Happiness, a guide for busy people, and also the book 100 Ways to Happy Children, a guide for busy parents. He also has an Audible, Habits for Action, how to stop the excuses and do what you know you should, plus an Audible, Habits for Happiness, 10 daily steps for living your happiest life and 10 steps for living your happiest work life. You can find Dr. Happy at www.drhappy.com. Welcome to the show. Well, hi guys. Welcome to the High Performance Guy podcast. My name is Jed Xavier and I am with Dr. Tim Sharp, also known as Dr. Happy. What is doing there, mate? What's this Dr. Happy thing?
Look, it's actually, it's been a nickname I suppose I've had for a couple of decades now. It came about when I made the shift. My background is in clinical psychology, and quite a few years ago I made a shift into what some people might know as positive psychology. So I was talking and working a lot in the areas of stress and depression and anxiety and those sorts of things, which I still do a bit of, but I made a very conscious shift, as a lot of psychology did back then, towards a greater focus on thriving and flourishing. And I was talking a lot more about happiness. A guy I used to do work with back then jokingly called me Dr. Happy, and it kind of stuck. Well, I suppose I've built a bit of a brand around it now, so that's kind of my stage name.
Yeah, well, I met you a couple of years ago when I ran a wellness and wellbeing event called Revive for the Australian real estate industry, and people I still see now say it was a great talk that you did, and they still seeing Dr. Happy. What's Dr. Happy up to? So it's certainly a great. It's certainly stuck, mate. So let's dive into it, mate. I mean, I guess the fundamental question is, you being an expert in happiness, is what is happiness and how do we define this thing?
Yeah, look, it's actually a much more complex question than you might realize.
I may not realize that.
Psychologists, and particularly positive psychologists, have written thousands upon thousands of words and articles and books on this. But I'll break it down into probably the 2 simplest ways of answering that question, and then maybe we can elaborate on it. The first way to understand happiness, which is probably the most common way, the way that most of your listeners would probably think about happiness, is that it's one form of positive emotion. So there's a whole range of what we call positive emotions, things like joy and satisfaction, calm, contentment, pride, and happiness is just one of them. But that's like all positive emotions, or all emotions generally, I suppose, that's kind of fleeting. It comes and goes fairly quickly. It's something we might feel for a few seconds or minutes, and then it's gone, and then something else comes along. So what positive psychology and what my focus has really been about is not so much those fleeting feel-good emotions. They're important. They're actually very important, but it's actually much more than that. It goes deeper than that. And it's probably more what I referred to just earlier as thriving and flourishing. And positive emotions are part of that type of happiness, but it's also much broader. So it's also about meaning and purpose, living a meaningful life. It's about our physical health and well-being. It's about our connections with others. So it's about a much bigger personal and world picture that we might think of as living our best life.
Doesn't it become the chicken and the egg though? If you are healthier, if you are around positive relationships, if you are experiencing that side of happiness which you described, doesn't that then in turn create the other aspect of happiness? So are the two really one in a sense?
Well, they're very closely related. So there's no doubt that positive emotions are important for living a good life. There's no doubt that living a good life will lead to more positive emotions. But I suppose the difference is, I said, that if we think about happiness in that first instance, just as a positive emotion, it's fleeting, it's relatively shallow, it doesn't really go deep. The other part is actually just as if not more important. Because if you think about living your best quality life, and I'm sure this is something you've done, I'm sure you've set goals and worked hard towards goals. I'm sure that's something you talk to a lot of your people about. As you will know then, if we're working towards a meaningful goal, there will be along the way blood, sweat and tears. There'll be some difficult times that aren't necessarily joyful, but they're still really important towards living a good life. So sometimes we need to work through difficult times to, as I said, put in that really hard work, that blood, sweat and tears to achieve something that's great, but it won't necessarily be always pleasurable.
Yeah. So the goal of working towards something is part of happiness then, even though it might
definitely.
be a slog and a struggle.
Sorry. Yeah. People talk about, I'm sure you've heard, and I'm sure everyone out there's heard, is it the journey or the destination? Well, it's both. They're both important. The destination's obviously important. If you set and work towards and then achieve a meaningful goal, that's fantastic. That sense of accomplishment is actually a really important part of living a good life. But we need to, as best we can, enjoy every step or almost every step along the way as well. So, when people sort of separate it into the journey or the destination, I think that's unhelpful. I think we need to look at both of them.
Yeah, interesting. I've listened to a lot of Sam Harris's stuff about pleasure and happiness, and people thinking happiness is reiterating just pleasure. What are your thoughts on pleasure and happiness? Like you talked about the fleeting aspect of being happy. What are your thoughts on that? Do we mistake pleasure for happiness, and that's a mistake, or is pleasure part of happiness?
Well, pleasure is part of it. So I guess going back to what I referred to earlier, pleasure is actually really important. It's important to have pleasure in our lives. We can't. I don't think we could really live our best possible lives if we didn't have some pleasure. But that being said, it should be, or we need to think about it as something more than that, something bigger than that, maybe something deeper than that. And that's where that, particularly, I suppose, that meaning and purpose comes in. Again, if you're living a really meaningful life, I mean, one of the most important things for me, for example, is doing good for others. And particularly there's a youth mental health charity that I'm very involved in. I give a lot to, and that gives me a lot of pleasure, a lot of happiness, or a lot of satisfaction, I suppose. But again, it's not always joyful. Life isn't always fun. So we do need we need pleasure, but we also need meaning and purpose. We also need connectedness. We need, to look at the big picture and a more global, I suppose, definition. I think it's important to have a broad, big definition of happiness so we can enjoy all the various components of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's like an existential purpose attached to being happy as well, as opposed to people just eating the ice cream, feeling good, and that's happiness.
Yeah, well, yeah. Look, if you think about that example of eating an ice cream or eating some chocolate or whatever it might be. That's great. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. So that's what. So the ancient Greeks, for example, had two words. They talked about hedonia, or what we might call hedonism, which is that pursuit of pleasure. Largely, I mean, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but that pursuit of pleasure. And we all know that's great. That's fantastic. Again, whether it's ice cream or chocolate or whatever it might be. I mean, even watching a great movie or seeing a good band, those things are actually really, really important. But again, by definition, we know they're relatively short-lived. And if that's all you pursue, you won't really get that deeper sense of satisfaction that goes with what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, which is living, again, a really meaningful life. Now, we could debate this. I don't actually believe that there is an inherent meaning or purpose in life. I think it's something we create. Which is a bit different. So I guess, there are various religious philosophies that would disagree with me, but from my perspective, and I think this is actually a very optimistic belief too, because I think it's something each and every one of us can create and recreate almost every day or every week. It's up to us to choose what meaning we want to ascribe to life.
Yeah, so therefore we're in the driver's seat about what makes us happy or what doesn't. What do you think about the spiritual sort of movement at the moment when they talk about, well, it's not about pleasure, it's not about joy and feeling good, and it's not about having meaning, it's about almost nothingness. What are your thoughts on that description of happiness? It transcends all of that, and we've got to find this place where we've just dissolved everything around us. Is that a bit of poppycock, you think?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think what's important is that there's not necessarily any right or wrong definitions of happiness. There are multiple definitions, and as I've already hinted at, there are religious perspectives, there are philosophical perspectives, there are psychological perspectives. One of the things that is important to state, and it might sound obvious, but it's important to state the obvious, is that we're all different. Yes. So what works for me won't necessarily work for you. My definition of happiness won't be exactly the same as yours. Now, having said that, we know there are some general principles that do apply to everyone. And we do know that a sense of spirituality can be very helpful. And by that, I mean having a belief in something bigger than just me as an individual. So that would include obviously major religions, but also a bit broader than that, believing that there's something more than just us, than just our day-to-day living. Yeah. Again, that doesn't have to be organized religion. So we do know that tends to be associated with high levels of well-being, but we also know that people's definitions of spirituality can vary tremendously. So no, in a sense, I don't believe it's poppycock. I do think that there is something to it, but again, it's up to each and every one of us to find our own version, I suppose, of spirituality. Yeah, or happiness. It's a very liberal way to look at it, I guess. Do you think society's sort of geared just to this is happiness, and that's part of the problem of people being happy, because they think there's this holy grail to what happiness actually should be, when what you're saying is it's really whatever you want it to be in whatever context you want it to be in and whatever construct. Do you think there's a problem in society that that's happiness and we need to go towards that? Yeah, I do actually. You started off at the beginning. My nickname's Dr. Happy. I'm the Chief Happiness Officer at Happiness Institute. So obviously I spend most of my life talking about happiness. I actually spend a significant chunk of that busting myths and misconceptions. There are lots of misunderstandings about happiness. And I think you're right. One of them is that there is a type of happiness, and particularly in, we're obviously talking in Australia, but I mean, across what you might call the Western world or the developed world, there is a belief and a strong perception, I suppose, that happiness is largely tied to material possessions and or wealth. Now, I do want to make it very clear, I've got nothing against material possessions. I've got nothing against wealth per se. Those things aren't inherently bad. But what we do know is that the extent to which they will provide meaningful happiness is limited. So they do provide a bit, and if you look at the other extreme, there's no doubt if you're under financial strain, if you're below the poverty line, that will lead to unhappiness. That can be very stressful. But increasing levels of wealth, having more and more stuff, doesn't necessarily provide that deeper, more meaningful sense of happiness that we really need. So, that is one of the myths, that if I just get that new iPhone, that new laptop, that new jacket, faster car, bigger house, whatever, I'll be happy. Well, we know that's not entirely true. What are some other myths? You've got me interested now. What are some other big ones you're busting at the moment? Oh, that's probably one of the big ones. I mean, I think one of the other ones is around achievement. I think, again, there's a lot of focus. I mean, I was brought up like this, I suppose, that if you, if you achieve more, you'll be happier. Now, that is true to a point. And I think I touched on this earlier, that there's no doubt that accomplishment and achievement, so setting and working towards meaningful goals, is important. There's a lot of positives that can come from that. But I do think I've certainly fallen into this trap of just striving, wanting more. And what the dark side of that is that we never appreciate, or we don't spend enough time being grateful for what we have, or being present in the moment. Because that sort of striving, which again does have some benefits, it's very future focused. What that can do is take us away from just being, at the risk of saying a bit of a cliche. But so that's, that is one of the other myths, that if I just climb that ladder and get more, I'll be happier and happier. Well, not entirely. Sometimes you need to pause, stop, take some time out, and just be in this moment for what it is.
Yeah, although based on what you're defining happiness as, it can be a part of our overall happiness, that climbing, that achievement. But when we make it just the thing, which is what most people do, it's either meditating for 20 hours a day, or it's getting the car, it sounds like it's, like I said, it's a liberal sort of form of happiness. Are people getting happier? And in your research and the years you've been in happiness, who's the happiest? Is there any studies on that?
Yeah, there are thousands of studies on pretty much every perspective of happiness you might want to think about.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because I've pretty much got every question about it. So,
there's two parts to that. So, sorry, I can't remember. What did you ask? Oh, are we getting happier? That's right. So,
are we getting happier? And is there we know there's a country that's the healthiest and lives the longest, but is there research on who's the happiest and why?
So what I'll say, I'll preface my response by saying that there are a lot of studies on this, and some really interesting stuff as well. But when we look at happiness in that context, like as in, you referred to those, the happiest countries list, which is really quite interesting. But it is important to note that what they're measuring there is slightly different to what we've already been talking about. So when we look at those national and international studies, firstly, they often measure different things. So every one of those studies is a bit different. You need to look carefully at the questions they ask, etc. But what they're often measuring there is not the sort of personal happiness that we've been mostly talking about, but quality of life. So that it's a little bit about what we're talking about, but it also often includes things like access to public health, access to public transport, education. So those sorts of things, which are actually really important at that global level, but again, a bit different. So when we look at that, if we take that into account and then come back to your question, are we getting happier? What we've seen over the last decade or so is that it's actually pretty consistent. Most people are mostly happy most of the time. That's a simple answer. What we do tend to see, again, taking into account the slightly different definition that I just referred to, we do see fluctuations according to a number of things, like economic changes. So, for example, if you go back to I think it was 2008, the global financial crisis, we saw a big dip. When you see things like global instability, you see dips. So you tend to get changes around those big, massive sort of global things like the economy, like wars, or those sorts of things. And more recently, last year, we saw a bit of a dip around COVID, obviously. So not that surprisingly, we saw higher levels of distress and mental ill health.
Yeah. I'm always interested when you see, countries or people that are obviously really less fortunate and their quality of life and health is really low. The kids seem to be happy, right? Is there something about that? I mean, why are kids always happy despite the hardship that some go through in particular countries as well?
Well, at the risk of busting that bubble,
maybe it's another myth.
It partly is. That's not entirely true. I mean, again, if you go to the war-torn zones, kids aren't happy, people aren't happy. There are parts of the world where people are, living off less than $2 a day. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. So it's not entirely true, but there is some truth to what you're referring to. So when we look at the happiest countries in the world, and I'm sure some of your listeners have seen this, at the very top, there are a number of countries that are almost always there, consistently there, and they're the Scandinavian countries, typically. So when we look at that and when we try to understand that, what we see is countries that are sort of socialist democracies, and where that's important is that, again, coming back to what I referred to earlier, although they have high tax, they have fantastic education, fantastic healthcare, fantastic public transport, all of those sort of public resources, strong safety nets, and a very low difference between the haves and the have-nots, or a lower difference. Yeah. So at that level, those are the sorts of things that lead to that sort of happiness, which again is a bit different to our personal happiness. But what we also see, which is probably maybe a bit more interesting, and coming back to the second part of your question, we do see a number of countries that would be considered less economically developed, but still ranking very highly. And there's a couple of South American countries and a couple of Southeast Asian countries. And what we see there, or the way that's been interpreted, is those countries tend to have very strong community focus, very strong social focus. So when you talk to people from some of those countries that aren't necessarily that wealthy, and they don't necessarily have that, the quality of life that we might consider important, but what they do say is that their family is so important, their neighborhoods are so important, their communities are. So they actually talk about happiness more as something that we experience rather than just I experience. And that's consistent with a lot of the research that said, one of the most important things is a sense of connectedness and belonging, regardless of any of the other things.
I mean, particularly within longevity. I mean, it's if you connect, the more social you are, the more connected you are in a relationship. That definitely makes sense. I've always been interested, so I've got to watch less of CNN. Mate, yep.
I was going to. You've hit on one of the simplest and most effective things we can do if we want to be happier is to watch less news.
There you go.
I have this love-hate relationship because I love to know what's going on, and like you do too. I talk to lots of people, so having a good general knowledge is important for me to sort of connect. And as I like to know what's going on, I like to be up to date with current affairs, but it can be bloody depressing sometimes. So,
and as you just proved, it can skew your reality and discernment about what's actually happening for people too. So
it can.
Yeah. So thanks for that heads up, mate. Men and women, mate, who's happier?
No, that's a really interesting one, and probably the most debatable that we've touched on so far. There are some really mixed findings, and that's partly because so what we need to take into account are there are some strong gender differences in not in how we necessarily experience emotions, but in how we express them. So where we need to be careful, and this even dates back to when we've looked at research into depression and anxiety. If we go back several decades, it was always considered to be the case that women experienced higher levels of that type of mental health, of depression, anxiety. But, and this is an important but, almost certainly at least some of that was accounted for by the fact that women are more willing to talk about it. They're more willing to admit to put their hands up, whereas us men, these are generalizations, but us men are more likely to keep it to ourselves. We're less like, and now this is changing a bit. Particularly we're seeing men more willing to talk about their emotions, etc. But still, we do see a general pattern that men are less likely to, and in fact, they have a smaller vocabulary when it comes to emotion. So that it's very tricky, and this is why another part of something I've been really fascinated in the last 5 or 10 years is men's mental health. One of the things we need to do is get men to talk more about it, and part of that is actually broadening their vocabulary around emotional literacy, or whatever you might want to call it. So that's a slightly different answer to your question.
It's a can of worms, that one, by the sounds of it. So men's health and happiness, what is happening in that area, and why is it because they're not talking about it enough that they're not as happy, or that they don't experience happiness to a level that they should? What's happening in the men's health sort of area? I mean, why are men particularly unhappy, just in general, not compared to women, but just in general as humans?
Well, I don't. Again, I'll preface this by saying that this is it's debatable. There are different people have interpreted different ways. I'm not necessarily sure that men are less happy now than they were.
Okay.
But what we're seeing are increasing rates of mental ill health amongst men. But I think that's at least partly due to men talking more about it. So in some ways, it's kind of a good thing. You know, it might sound a bit strange, but when I see increasing rates of men's depression, for example, and increasing rates of men seeking help, in some ways that's a good thing, because in the past that was hidden. And the example I often give is my grandfather was an Anzac. He came back from the war with almost certainly what I now think was almost certainly PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But he never had a diagnosis. He never talked about it. He would never have seen a doctor, let alone a psychologist. So that's only 2 generations ago. I mean, my father's generation was probably similar in the sense that it just wasn't spoken about. So a lot of it was hidden. It was swept under the carpet. It was denied. So what we're seeing now, which I think is actually, is a really important and I think a really good movement, is men being more vulnerable, men being more authentic, men being more willing to put up their hand and say, I'm doing it really tough. But what the downside, I suppose the risk in that is that the statistics look really bad.
Yes.
And they are in a way, but hopefully there'll be a good upswing to that as more men get more help. And as we talk to our sons about that as well, I'm optimistic that it's sort of heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I think the reporting over the more reporting over the years has been very helpful, because in my dad's day, I didn't, you wouldn't have known what was going on. I grew up, you don't talk about how you're feeling. So it's good that it's changing now. There's a men's group on every corner, and people screaming at mountains every weekend. So it's it's a good thing. What's been the biggest surprise in your career, in your research and study around happiness? What's been the biggest thing that sort of stood out for you that you've gone, that's it, very interesting?
Well, I don't know if I'd say it's a surprise, but if you'd asked me 10 or 20 years ago, I probably would have been a bit surprised. But certainly the biggest standout, without a doubt, and this comes back to a point we made just a few minutes ago. If as we touched on a bit already, my background was in clinical psychology. I focus more on positive psychology. I've researched and worked in the areas of health and well-being and longevity, as you touched on earlier. The strongest finding through all of that, or across all of that, if I had to name the biggest of the biggest findings out of all of that, it's this bit around connection and belonging. The most important thing we can do, any of us can do for our health, our well-being, our longevity, our quality of life, our success in life, is to connect with others. And we see this even in, we see this in a business context, in a productivity context. The most successful people are not successful on their own. They're just not. The happiest people are not happy on their own. The healthiest people, when we look at all of those people across all of those different categories, those people that are doing the best in life are at least partly doing the best. Well, they take responsibility and they do what they can, but they're at least partly doing the best they can because they have good quality connections, they have good quality relationships, they reach out and ask for help and reach out and give help. So again, if I had to name the big number one, it would be around that, relationships, connectedness, belonging.
And so what's happening in that exchange that makes people feel happy? Well, is it a chemical response? Is it a spirit? Do you know what's the exchange?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and it's probably all of those things. So I guess if you go back, there's something that we haven't really touched on so far, but a really interesting strand of psychology is called evolutionary psychology, which tries to understand, who we are and what we do from an evolutionary perspective. So that's, it's pretty obvious, really, I suppose. But if you look back for, not just decades that I've been thinking about this, but hundreds or thousands upon thousands of years. Most people would, one of the more obvious findings is that we are social animals. That we survived as a species, at least partially because we formed clans and tribes, groups. And that, many humans wouldn't have survived, or maybe we wouldn't have survived in the form that we did without the support of those clans and tribes and groups. So that's been part of our survival in a sense for, thousands upon thousands of years. That's also been argued as being one of the most significant contributors to develop society. I mean, you can't build the first towns, the first cities couldn't have been built by individuals. Obviously, we needed to come together and collaborate, which we did,
Yep.
which we still need to do. So there's that social, the fact that we're social animals, that we've needed that's contributed to our success in a sense, that's still very relevant. But there are biological or physiological contributors as well. We know, for example, that when we connect, there's been some fascinating research that when we spend time with someone, particularly someone we like, there's a physiological reaction.
Yeah.
There are natural, hormones and neurotransmitters that are released in our brain, that are released throughout our bodies, that give us almost like a high. It's almost like a natural high that we get. And I think, again, if I just come back to something really obvious, if I ask your listeners to think about the last time they caught up with a good friend, maybe it was coffee or a beer, or maybe the last time they went to a dinner party, or whatever it might be, or even a work colleague, and you come out of that, you often feel really good. There is, and we sometimes forget about that, or we take it for granted.
Yeah.
But that's a really important part of happiness and well-being. So, so it is, it's physical, physiological, social, psychological, all of those different aspects, all of those components of ourselves benefit from connecting well with others.
So that evolutionary aspect of it, would that be connected to safety? Because obviously that was a feeling safe. So feeling safe could be part of building happiness, or well.
Almost certainly. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And we wouldn't have survived back in those days, and even more recently, I suppose, without the security. And that's why. So that there's a different issue in a different part of psychology where we're looking at conformity. Why do we want to belong? Well, by belonging, contributes to being accepted. Being accepted as part of the clan or tribe or group was important, because if you weren't accepted, if you were thrown out, then you were on your own, and that was definitely riskier and less safe. So that's why we often, we want to feel part of something. We want to belong. That's why you see trends and fashions. Why do people dress the same? Well, it's part of belonging to something, and there are pros and cons to that, of course, but it's part of belonging to something, which is really, really important.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. You talked about chemicals before. What is their role, just their basic role in happiness?
Well, again, it depends what type of happiness you're talking about. If you're talking about that pleasure that we talked about, then they play a very big role. There are neurotransmitters. People have probably heard of serotonin or even adrenaline. There are so neurotransmitters are natural drugs. They're drugs that our brain effectively produces, and this happens all the time. Constantly throughout the day, when you eat, or when you're hungry, when you do something enjoyable or something painful, these things are, our brains are constantly producing these sorts of things. So, but there's definitely, there are definitely the production of certain neurotransmitters and hormones is definitely associated with that feeling, the good feeling that we get when we do something pleasurable. But that's that's kind of a minute-to-minute short-term thing. Over the longer term, it's a different way we need to look at it, and that's more to do, I suppose, broader aspects of health and well-being generally. And one of the really, this is still fairly new science. Might be getting a bit off track here, but it's something I'm really quite fascinated, or a lot of people are fascinated at the moment, is gut health. You've probably heard about this, a very trend topical.
It's a new brain, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is really exciting. It's fairly new, really. Talking the last sort of 5 or 10 years in a serious way. But what we're now starting to think is that, so our guts are very closely connected to our brains. They're linked, and what we're now starting to see is that what goes in our guts is very important for our health and well-being and our happiness. Again, I think it's fairly early days, so there's still a lot we don't know. But I think we're going to see. Well, we're definitely going to learn a lot more in the next 5-10 years about gut health and associated dietary and nutritional aspects and mental health. So, that's actually really kind of quite exciting area, which again, I think will if we come back in 10 years, there'll be a lot more to say, I think. So,
is that because of the chemical exchange, or has that got something to do with the nutrients and, the association with chemicals and stuff? Or?
Well, yeah, all of those things. So what they're saying, and I don't claim to be an expert in this area. I'm certainly reading and listening as much as I can about it. But what they're saying is that, so a lot of those neurotransmitters and hormones and natural drugs that we've for some time thought of as brain chemicals, they're now saying that a significant proportion of them are actually produced in the gut. And it's all connected. It's not that surprising. It's just that it hasn't really been looked at in detail before. So what that means, if they're produced in the gut, then our gut health is important for our brain health. Effectively, they're the same almost. So
So eating right to be happy at the end of the day. John?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, so that's, I did touch on this very briefly before, but we've talked about happiness and psychological health, but our physical health and well-being is very intimately connected to that. So definitely what we eat is very important. I mean, if there's no doubt, if you eat a lot of crap, you're less likely to be healthy, you're less likely to be happy. If you eat well, and you don't need to do anything too extreme here, just good, healthy, nutritious, natural, real foods, you're more likely to be healthier and happier. And similarly with exercise, for example, I mean, one of the strongest findings we know is that regular exercise, yes, it's good for our body. So it's, if you want to build up biceps and six pack or cardio, it's fantastic. But it's also really good for our mental health. In fact, for me, regular exercise is probably one of the most important things for my mental health. I do it regularly, just as much for my psychological well-being as my physical well-being.
Yeah. Knowing so much about happiness, do you have a regime, a ritual, a process? Are you now in a zone where you get up in the day and bang, I know how to be the happiest in my life by doing this, and that? Or is it still an experiment to an extent?
Well, a bit of both. I do know a lot about it, but that doesn't mean I'm always perfect at doing it. So, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, there's something.
But are you conscious that when you're not feeling that happiness or connected, are you conscious of it, and then you go, oh, I know exactly how to pivot and what to do?
Largely, but yeah. So as I'm sure a lot of listeners out there's something I've talked about a lot over the years is the knowing doing gap. It's one thing to know something; it's another thing to do it. So
I've got an audible as well on that. I know as well. So
my latest audible book's exactly on that. But so I definitely know a lot, and I don't mean to say that in an arrogant way, but I do know a lot, but I don't always do it perfectly. And the other thing is, I don't think we've talked about this before, but although, I focus a lot on happiness in my career, I've also experienced significant depression for most of my adult life, along with some pretty serious suicidal ideation at times. So It's not something that comes naturally to me. I do know what to do, and I do try to do it regularly. So for example, I exercise regularly, I meditate regularly, I try to eat really well, I focus on doing good for others and trying to connect with others. But it doesn't always work perfectly. So I definitely have my ups and downs like everyone. And the other part is it changes over time. So for example, last year was a particularly difficult year for lots of us for all sorts of reasons. Our lives and the world was changed. Already this year, things aren't magically different, but already I'm starting, for a couple of other reasons as well, things are a bit different now. And that will always happen. Things change. You get older, your kids get older, your work changes. So that's one of the other things that's really important about happiness is even if we think we've got the routine down pat, we need to be prepared to be flexible because next week, next month, next year, things will be a bit different. So it is even if you know everything, it's an ongoing process of adaptation and flexibility and changing where we need to.
So for you, having experienced what you just mentioned before, what are your go-tos to elevate you back to the equilibrium of, okay, I'm back on track now. What are the particular, is it just exercise and eating, or is it affirmation? What is it?
No, well, so the exercise and eating it's just something I do every day, and it helps tremendously. And I even on my really bad days, I can pretty much always still keep that up. It's just so important to me. The thing for me personally, that I probably find harder, the thing that it's super helpful for me, but I probably find hardest is the connecting with others. I'm actually a fairly introverted person. I have some really good, I've got an incredibly supportive and loving wife. I've got some really good, small group of really good friends, but my default reaction if my depression starts to kick in is to withdraw. Now that's okay at times. It's not entirely a bad thing. I like to spend time on my own. I need to spend time on my own. But what I need to sort of, I guess, force myself to do sometimes is reach out and connect and not get too locked away, because that can actually just make things worse, I suppose. So, so that's probably the biggest thing for me is to firstly reach out to my wife, mostly, who is usually very close, so that's not hard to do. But I mean that more in an emotional context. And then increasingly other people to not get too, so sometimes I have to force myself to call someone up, meet someone, whatever, even though I don't feel like it, because I know it'll help. So right. But again, everyone's different, and it really is important to find your own strategies. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. The strategies are important. What drew you into this whole commitment to, happiness? Because you do it with families, business, individuals. Like what was it? Was there anything in particular where you said, that's it, I'm just going to lay my hat on this and be committed?
Well, it was a couple of things. So interestingly, when I first got interested in psychology, way or just after school, I suppose, and I didn't really know much about it then, but that's really what I was interested in. I always did and still love sport, and I knew that I was never. I was kind of good enough at a school level, I suppose, but I knew I'd never, play for Australia or play for. But I was always fascinated by sports psychology. So I guess even, I love sport. I loved watching it. And even from quite a young age in my teenage years, my dad was big into sport. Our family was big into sport. So I used to watch a lot and talk a lot. And even back then, I think I was always fascinated by what we now call performance psychology. I mean, it didn't really have what people called sports psychology. But so back then, although I didn't really know how to talk about it, I was really interested in high performance and why were some players that much better than others, I guess. And that's sort of what I was really fascinated in. But it didn't really exist here in Australia. So, I was searching around, and this is kind of just before the internet, I suppose. So, I tried to find books around American sports was bigger on that. So, but anyway, that's what I was really interested in, I suppose, high performance, which is like positive psychology, but that didn't exist then. So I kind of got waylaid into clinical psychology, which I don't regret because it was fantastic and very satisfying and I really loved it. But it wasn't exactly what I really wanted to do when I first started out. So when positive psychology came along a bit into my career, and I saw this focus, not just on dysfunction and distress, but on thriving and success and performance, it's kind of what was like, wow, that's what I always wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I grabbed hold of it, set up the Happiness Institute, and started to really focus on it. Which I wish I could have done a bit. Don't wish, but it's sort of what I always wanted to do, I suppose. So.
Was that part, because you got a PhD, was that part of that process or journey or?
No, that was actually before. So my PhD was actually in pain, believe it or not. So PhD, but it was still very relevant. So although I didn't realize it at the time, my PhD research was, the population we were looking at were chronic pain patients. But my research was actually looking at the support of what we called a significant other. So for example, it was looking at, if you have chronic pain, for example, what does your wife, girlfriend, supporter, what does he or she do to support you, and does that make it better or worse, kind of thing? So although I didn't really realize it at the time, I was really looking into this bit about connectedness and belonging and social support, and which we found, not surprisingly, to be massively important. So regardless of the person's pain, if they had the right sort of support, they functioned a lot better. It's a very simple version, but
interesting.
Yeah,
sort of like prefaced everything you were going to do with the happiness stuff.
Although I didn't realize it at the time, but in some ways I did.
Yeah, good foundation. Tell us a little bit about the Happiness Institute and what have you been, the most proud of with that creation? I'm
lucky to have, not lucky, but I'm proud to have done a lot of really good work. I suppose it's been really exciting and an incredibly fulfilling and satisfying decade or two. I suppose I'm pretty proud to have been pretty much the first person in Australia to wave the flag of positive psychology. And again, I don't like to sound immodest or arrogant, but really when I started, no one else in Australia was talking about it. And although now there are lots of people doing fantastic work, I think in some ways I played a part in planting the seed here in Australia and even internationally in a way. So, but I think I've also so I've worked with lots of organizations, lots of individuals, and it's been both fascinating and satisfying. Most recently, I suppose what I've really enjoyed doing is working with organizations to build positive culture. And particularly, I suppose that I think I mentioned earlier, there's a youth mental health charity that I do a lot of work with, and I've worked really hard with them to build a positive culture, an organizational culture where health and well-being is paramount. And the reason I'm part of that is that they do such fantastic work, but they can only do that if they're looking after themselves. So that's been my focus, is helping them look after themselves so they can then go and make a fantastic difference out in the world. So that's been, again, very satisfying.
That's awesome. I shared some information about you on the intro, and there'll be stuff in the notes as well that people can follow up, because there's some great resources and tools on your site. So that's definitely something to look at. What's the next trend in happiness do you perceive?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure if there's anything radically new happening at the moment because it's fairly well established. Again, the positive psychology as a formal discipline is now, well, probably about 20 years old. But even before that, there was some of the groundwork, philosophy and psychology research happened even before that. So, we've got a lot of research now, got a very strong foundation, and I don't think there's anything that are radically new happening. It's really just about building on that, strengthening what we know, building on the applications so we can teach more people how to do it. I guess one area that has, so positive psychology is often talked about as having a couple of phases, I suppose. There was kind of, there was, phase one, which is like a infancy, then there was adolescence, and now we're kind of into a mature adulthood.
Yeah.
One of the things that has changed a lot, which I think is really important, has been a movement from just focusing on positive emotions, which came about because psychology historically had only ever focused on negative emotions. So as I said, in my clinical psychology career, all we ever talked about was stress, depression, misery, which is important. But so positive psychology was kind of a response to what had been a negative psychology. So there's a big focus on happiness and joy and satisfaction that we hadn't talked a lot about. But then people sort of realized, well, that's obviously great, but we can't totally forget about those negative emotions, and we need to actually recognize that they play an important role as well. So in the last few years, as positive psychology has matured, we've seen almost like a going back or an integration of the earlier life, which is that, things like anxiety are important. We need them. Things like anger even and sadness are normal human emotions. So I think what we've got to now, and what this sort of current phase is about, is yes, positive emotions are really important. Yes, happiness is really important, but so too are all of those emotions, and we need to accept all of them for what they are and the role they play in our lives.
Yeah, very interesting. I'd love to talk to you more about that at another time, the negative and positive emotions. But I think the takeaway for me is that, happiness just isn't built on trying to accumulate positive experiences consistently. There's this whole other almost existential aspect to it of connection and being part of something and bonding and all that as well, and the two sort of meet. So just sort of to wrap up, mate, I really appreciate your input. There's been a lot of great stuff here. What would you say in summing up the people that are listening that they could do today to increase their happiness outside of what's been sort of offered so far?
Well, I think part of the answer is actually in the question you just asked, which is to recognize that happiness is something over which you have some control. That might sound obvious, but for some people, for example, think, and this is one of the other myths, I suppose, that, I'm just born a certain way. So some people, I'm born happy, or I'm born unhappy, or I'm born optimistic, or I'm born pessimistic. Well, that's not entirely true. To some extent, we are born with a temperament or a personality, but to a large extent, we've got some control over that. We've got some say in it. So that's actually the first step. If you don't recognize that you have some control, you're not going to do anything about it. So that's the first thing I'd say, is to recognize this is something you can create, you can build, you can develop. And then to identify the things that you need to do, because as I said, we're all different. And that's partly through trial and error. So, there's lots of places you can research the main strategies, and we've talked about them: exercise, connecting, meditation. Try them out, test them out, find out what works for you, and then find a way to build your methods into your daily life so they become habitual.
Last question. Is it ever possible that we'll get to a point as humans where we will be consistently happy without any dips?
No, and I don't think we should want to be, because I said earlier, certain types of unhappiness are important. I mean, for example, if you, again, think about someone that never experienced sadness. So think about, again, I'm sure everyone listening out there through 2020 in some way or other had some loss. Maybe they lost a loved one, maybe they lost some income, maybe they lost a job. Now, it's perfectly normal to grieve in some way. So, if you think about someone that's consistently happy that never grieved or never got upset, that would kind of be pretty weird. And we need to accept that those unpleasant emotions, although by definition they're unpleasant, they're actually an important part of living a fulfilling, complete human life. It's part of being a human.
Yeah. Dr. Happy, you've certainly made me happy. It's been a great chat, mate. I really appreciate your time. And like I said, we'll put your website and resources stuff in the show notes so people can reach out and definitely have a look at that stuff and definitely get your Audible stuff because it's fantastic. So, mate, great to see you again. Appreciate your time and your wisdom. And, looking forward to what you do in the next 20 years, mate.
Thanks. Yeah, great to connect again, Jet. And keep up the great work that you're doing. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, mate. Cheers. Well, thanks for listening to the Jet Xavier Show podcast. I hope you're more energized, optimized, and potentialized in your life and business from listening to it and sharing this time with us. If you're after more inspiration and more information about how to become a high-performance human, then simply go to jetxavier.com. We would love to hear from you. Cheers.